I stood at the edge of the private terminal, suitcase in hand, watching Cassandra's sleek jet climb into the morning sky. The roar of the engines faded, but the weight in my chest didn't. That trip was supposed to be our anniversary celebration, an escape from our hectic lives, something we'd been planning together for months. Yet there she went, alone, without a word of explanation. Not a delayed message, not a change in plan. Just a cold, deliberate takeoff that left me behind. For a few long moments, I just stood there, numb. I could have called her, chased after her, demanded to know why. But instead, something shifted inside me. The hurt was still fresh, but beneath it, a quiet strength stirred. I didn't need her permission to live my life. I didn't need her presence to feel whole. So, with a newfound resolve, I walked straight to the booking counter and asked for the next flight to Paris. No return ticket. No second thoughts. As I sat waiting for my flight, I opened my laptop and typed out a message I never thought I'd send. It was addressed to our mutual legal advisor, a preliminary draft of a separation agreement. I scheduled it to send automatically, timed to land in her inbox just after her plane touched down. I could almost picture her expression when she read it. Surprise, confusion, maybe even a flicker of panic. Her carefully managed world, one she had constructed with precision and control, would no longer include me on her terms. When I finally arrived in Paris, the chill in the spring air met me like a welcome embrace. The city buzzed with life, motorbikes zipping past, artists sketching along the Seine, the scent of fresh croissants wafting through narrow, cobbled streets. I felt alive in a way I hadn't in years. I wandered aimlessly at first, camera slung around my neck, snapping shots of vibrant street corners, quiet alleyways, and the way light danced off old stone buildings. Photography had once been my passion, but it had slowly faded in Cassandra's world of business dinners and sleek ambition. Now, in Paris, it returned to me like an old friend. As I explored the city, I began to shed the layers of who I had become in that relationship. The silent partner, the convenient plus one, the shadow to her spotlight. I realized how much of myself I had set aside to make space for her needs, her dreams, her plans. But now I was walking unfamiliar streets with a sense of freedom I hadn't known I craved. One afternoon, while sipping espresso at a quiet cafe in Le Marais, I heard a familiar voice call my name. I turned to see Marco Levant, a former investor in Cassandra's tech firm. We hadn't spoken in years, but he remembered me. We chatted briefly, and he invited me to a tech summit happening that week. I hesitated at first. Wasn't that her world, not mine? But then I saw the opportunity for what it was, a chance to confront the ghosts of my past, not to relive them, but to show myself how far I'd come. The summit was a whirlwind of familiar faces, polished pitches, and glossy ambition. But I walked through it differently this time on my own terms. I wasn't Julian Cole, Cassandra's partner. I was just Julian. And, to my surprise, that was more than enough. Inspired by the energy of the city and the conversations I had there, I decided to do something bold. I rented a small gallery space and curated an exhibit of my photography. It had been years since I had put my work on display, but the moment I saw my photos framed against the white walls, something inside me clicked. This was more than an exhibit. It was a declaration, a reclaiming, a beginning. A few days later, I reached out to Cassandra and asked to meet. We sat across from each other at a cafe, not far from where we had once strolled hand in hand in happier times. She looked elegant as always, composed but wary. Her first words were sharp, demanding an explanation for the email and my sudden absence. But I didn't flinch. I told her calmly that I was done being a spectator in my own life. I handed her a card, my lawyer's contact. No anger, no drama. Just closure. She looked at it for a long moment, then at me, and for the first time, I think she realized I was no longer hers to manage. That night, as I walked along the banks of the Seine, Paris glittering around me, I felt lighter than I had in years. The city hummed with possibility, and so did I. I was no longer waiting for someone else to define me or give my life meaning. I had rediscovered myself, through art, through solitude, through unexpected encounters, and I knew this was just the beginning. On my final night in Paris, I stood on a quiet bridge, looking out at the city that had held me while I healed. I felt grateful, not for the pain, but for what it had pushed me to find. A self I had long forgotten. A life that was finally mine. As I stood on that bridge, the lights of Paris shimmering on the water below, I let the silence wrap around me like a blanket. The city didn't rush. It didn't demand. It simply existed, beautiful, chaotic, alive, and in that still moment, so did I. The following morning, I packed my things with a sense of peace I hadn't felt in a long time. My suitcase was lighter, not because of what I'd taken out, but because of what I'd left behind: guilt, doubt, the constant need to keep up with someone else's expectations. Cassandra's voice, once constantly echoing in my mind, had finally gone quiet, and in its place was my own, steady, calm, and finally clear. Before heading to the airport, I returned to the gallery one last time. The exhibit had drawn in more people than I expected. Locals, tourists, even a few fellow photographers had stopped by and left thoughtful notes in the guest book. One message in particular caught my eye. "Your work feels like truth, raw, brave, and beautiful. Thank you for sharing your story." I stood there, tracing the words with my fingers, realizing that this, more than any flight or farewell, was my true departure point. Not just from Cassandra, but from a version of myself that no longer served me. At the airport, there was no dramatic send-off. Just the quiet satisfaction of knowing I was returning home different than when I'd left. Not broken, but rebuilt. I boarded the plane with no one waiting for me on the other side, and that thought, instead of frightening me, felt strangely freeing. Back home, life moved on, but I moved with it differently. I started freelancing again, taking photography projects that inspired me, that made me feel something. I met new people, not through shared connections, but through shared passions. And every now and then, I found myself sharing stories from Paris, of the cafe where I faced the past, the summit where I stood tall, the exhibit where I finally saw myself. Cassandra reached out once after that. A short message. Polite. Distant. She congratulated me on the exhibit and wished me well. I thanked her sincerely. Not for the message, but for everything that came before it, for the pain that became my push, for the silence that forced me to listen to myself. Now, when I look in the mirror, I don't see someone who was left behind. I see someone who chose to move forward. Someone who chose to live, not for another person, not for approval, but for the truth of who they are. And that truth, after everything, is more than enough. My story didn't end in Paris. It began there.